I'm a big fan of real journalism, and I consider our next guest a real journalist. Pete Tucker has been on the program before. I really appreciate his writing. You should check it out in Counterpunch. He's written for the Huffington Post. He's written for a bunch of other places as well, but I won't take up your time listing them. And lately he's been writing on a couple things. One on the coverage of the Ben Jealous campaign in Maryland, and also on the way pollsters are treating black progressives, both of which are really interesting topics to me. So here to discuss them, with no further ado, Pete Tucker. Welcome to the program, Pete.
So good to be here, Richard.
Good to have you back. So let's start with this, because you've been writing some great stuff lately at Counterpunch. Let's start with the Ben Jealous campaign. You're kind of like, I think, you know, reading between the lines, you're kind of like me in that you like to write something, cover it, and then move on. But you've actually now written twice about the Washington Post and its coverage of the Ben Jealous campaign. When that happens, there's got to be a good reason. So let's start from the beginning. I have noticed, believe me, I've noticed the Washington Post coverage of Ben's campaign. I live now in Maryland. I get the Washington Post every morning, and I vote in Maryland. So I certainly remember the coverage before the primary and now. So let's talk about that a little bit. How has the Washington Post been treating old Ben?
Well, you helped out with the Bernie Sanders campaign, so you're familiar with the Post going crazy on candidates. In the primary, they were actually pretty decent, which kind of surprised me. But the moment Ben Jealous won the primary, and no polls predicted he would win by a landslide, which is exactly what he did, it was back to this aggressive campaigning almost to ensure that he did not become the next governor of the state of Maryland. I think for folks listening, that might seem like a big statement. I mean, the Washington Post, particularly now with its aggressive reporting on President Trump, a lot of people on the left are really think very highly of the Post. And I think very highly of the aggressive reporting on Trump too. But I think it's important to step back and look at the history of the Post. For example, if you take Trump out of the equation, you know, and the Post has really ridden this resistance wave to extraordinary heights, maybe a level of prominence not seen since it's the Watergate and Pentagon Papers era. But if you take the resistance to Trump out, and you take Trump out of the picture, what exactly is the Post resisting? Not war, it's for every single one. Not economic inequality, it is against unions. And now it's owned by Jeff Bezos, the founder and CEO of Amazon. And so I think that context helps to understand why the Post would go so hard at Jealous. And they are going so hard. They have called him a coup leader. They've said his left-wing platform is craven and reckless and will blow a Chesapeake-sized hole in the state budget. And they say what he's doing isn't politically wise or practical. And the funny thing is, Richard, if you look at it, for example, take $15 an hour. 71% of Marylanders favor a $15 an hour minimum wage, a central plank of Jealous's platform. Hogan opposes it, the Republican governor, Larry Hogan. So which really, and you can go on down the list,
right,
issue after issue, he has majority to supermajority support Jealous does for his platform. There's not one issue where Hogan has majority support. His lead issue is expanding and privatizing the highways. He can't get out of the 40s on that. And yet it is Jealous who is consistently described as being extreme. He stands with the large majority of Marylanders. And Hogan, who's standing with a small minority, who's said to be a centrist, a radical centrist, whatever that means, moderate, bipartisan, pragmatic, pretty much the opposite of Trump. These are all quotes you can read in the Washington Post.
You know, what you're describing, Pete, and I've written about this myself, and not in a while, but, and if I ever had any hopes of placing an op-ed in the Washington Post, I'm about to trash them. But I obviously have thoughts on this, and one of them is, my sense is that the Washington Post has led the charge in defending the quote-unquote bipartisan status quo of the influential and powerful members of both parties, but the elites, as they're traditionally known. So they're strong reporting on Donald Trump, in a sense, is the right thing for the wrong reason. This is the way I take it. So, for example, yes, it's right to dig into what Donald Trump is doing, but to do it because he's kind of not a member of our club is not the right motivation. And I sense that's their motivation. But to me, what they're doing to Ben Jealous is right out of that playbook. It's basically saying that a moderate quote-unquote Republican can sit down with a moderate quote-unquote Democrat and agree that it's okay to help Saudi Arabia bomb Yemen and create the worst humanitarian crisis in many years, including, you know, a death sentence for many of those children who are suffering from malnutrition, all that. That's okay, because that's in the club. But when a Ben Jealous comes along who supports $15 an hour minimum wage, better health care for Marylanders, and so on down the line, all positions that Marylanders, by and large, a majority of Marylanders support, that's not the way the club talks. So he becomes an opponent. He needs to be crushed. And I'm also going to add that for me, calling a black politician a coup leader really is racist. I'm going to just come out and say that. To me, to say that, you know, sort of implies, you know, like they are in those countries. And I take great exception to it.
It reminds me, there's one other term that has been repeatedly and repeatedly used in the form of a question, but it's really become a charge against Jealous. Are you a socialist?
Right.
He says, I'm not a socialist, I'm a venture capitalist. I don't know how many times that man has to say that. And yet they keep saying, wait, are you a socialist? Larry Hogan and the Republican Governors Association are spending millions of dollars running ads saying you're a socialist. So are you a socialist again? And finally, he said, no, this is the type of thing that they've done to Obama. This is the type of thing that Martin Luther King had to deal with. This is the type of thing that it's a straight out of the Republican playbook to hit people with socialists, and particularly black leaders with that charge. And then the Post asked him again. And it was finally after that, he just got frustrated and said, are you effing kidding me?
Which I thought was funny, but that didn't poll well at all. I actually laughed when I saw that clip, but apparently hurt him. Yeah.
But if you look, they leave out all the context. That he's constantly being asked when he's a socialist, how many times you got to say, I'm not a socialist, I'm a venture capitalist. And Richard, there's another part to that, which is if you look at what Ron DeSantis, the Republican candidate for governor in Florida, said about Andrew Gillum. He used a racial slur, Andrew Gillum, the progressive mayor, African-American mayor of Tallahassee. He used a racial slur the night that Gillum won the Democratic nomination. And he said, the last thing we need to do is monkey this up by trying to embrace a socialist agenda. That socialist agenda is right there. Now Hogan and the Republican Governors Association and the Washington Post don't use the racial slur. But the second part is, the man's not a socialist, so why do you keep asking, really accusing him of being one?
Yeah, no, and I got to say, by the way, I'm more sympathetic to socialists than I am to venture capitalists as a rule.
Sure.
But that said, I like Ben Jealous so much that when I moved to Maryland, I actually re-registered as a Democrat for the first time in years so that I could vote for him in the primary. So Ben Jealous made me a Democrat. So the idea, and I've seen those Republican Governors Association ads, and by the way, Ben is a very, if you've met him, very calm, composed person. Those Republican governors ads, they must have gone digging for an angry black man picture, because that's what they use. And so again, I think there's a racial charge to all this, whether it was intentional on the part of the Post to call him a coup leader or whether it was subconscious or not, I don't know, but I do take profound exception to that. So they've been really going after him, trying to marginalize him, trying to make, by implication, Larry Hogan look like he's somehow a reasonable guy. Is Larry Hogan a reasonable guy?
People need to know more about Larry Hogan's background. He started a group called Change Maryland that came out of nowhere and just exploded on Facebook. And it was kind of Tea Party-like, which is awkward in a state of Maryland, which is 2-1 Democratic, as you said. But he was riding that Tea Party energy, and 2014 was the perfect year for him to run. The lowest voter turnout since World War II. And voters of color and young voters stayed home in large numbers. And he was able to knock off the Democratic nominee. Also, he was with, directly before being governor, the Maryland Public Policy Institute, which received funding from the Koch brothers donor network. The Koch brothers have also donated directly to Hogan. And this is just not mentioned. This is just not known. He's treated like he's some bastion. He's also vice chair of the Republican Governors Association. So you see in just repeatedly in articles, he's so different than Trump. Trump, who in no small measure is president because of the Koch brothers. I mean, they might not have directly said we like Trump, but they targeted, the competitive Senate seats and won 7 out of 8, I think, of the Senate seats they targeted by turning out Republican voters in those swing states. Thus, President Trump. So he's got, Koch brother support. He's targeted immigrants, and you go on down the line. He's called union leaders thugs, the teachers union, and he's targeted. And this is one of the things I'm looking at now. He's targeted reporters. He stopped doing that when Trump finally became president. But this is not a moderate. Now, you want to compare him to Trump, fine, but Maryland's not the country. Maryland is a 2-to-1 Democratic state. So I don't think that's. What I think Larry Hogan is he's Maryland's Trump. It's different, but it's not that different. And I think if people knew some of the background, they would find it really quite eye-opening.
Yeah, I think they would too. And a law professor named Doug Colbert wrote a great piece for op-ed for the Baltimore Sun talking about the fact that the next governor or whoever gets the next term as governor will appoint based on mandatory term limits or age limits. I think it's 5 out of the 7 members of the D.C. Court of Appeals. Now we're at a stage where Maryland Court of Appeals. Thank you. So we're at a stage in history where, thanks to those senators that the Koch brothers helped elect, Brett Kavanaugh is now on the Supreme Court. There's a conservative, radical right-wing majority on the Supreme Court. Marylanders are going to need their court to defend their rights, and you have this guy who's gotten Koch money in a perfect position to appoint the overwhelming majority of the court, which will be for many years to come. I don't understand how a state that's I don't understand how a state that's 2/3 Democratic can be trending right now so heavily for a Republican who's so deep in the business world. I think he was a developer, Larry Hogan. But then when we talk about the news coverage, I think we know how.
Right. The Post is it's hard to explain if you're not from the D.C. area, and that includes the very vote-rich Maryland suburbs. Montgomery County alone has 1 million people. It's hard to explain just how influential the Post is. It's really the only game in town. And so it's interesting. The night that Ben won, the next day that Ben Jealous won the primary, the next day, the paper had a good article on his victory. And next to it, the Post wrote how Democrats will be voting for Hogan. They sized it up, and they're going to steer, Maryland is 60% white, 30% black. And so they understand that they're going to have to deliver white voters to Hogan. And so they are hitting that. It is amazing how many articles there have been, Democrats voting for Hogan. Mind you, when President Obama endorsed Jealous, that was buried on page B4 of Metro.
Interesting, yeah.
Because he's the Democrat. They'll happy to give prominent space to any other Democrat, particularly black Democrats, who will criticize Jealous. But when President Obama comes out, you could find that buried on page B4. They don't want Jealous being associated with Obama, who won Maryland in his 2 elections by 25 and 26 points, any more than they want Hogan being associated with Trump. You mentioned the real estate company. Hogan has a real estate company named after himself. I don't know if that sounds at all familiar. He has not put it in a blind trust. You can read in today's Post, because Jealous directly brought this up, the Post has just refused to cover it until then. He has expanded his deals he's now in 20 separate projects. When he took office, it's now up to 36. He's the governor. He has a large real estate company that is growing. not in a blind trust.
So before we go, just real quickly, in the couple minutes we have left, now we're being told that Ben Jealous is 20 points down in the polls. Ben Jealous, as you mentioned earlier, his victory in the primary was unexpected. Now, primary populations are a little less predictable than elections in general, but pollsters, particularly partisan pollsters, you wrote about this for Counterpunch too, they haven't been good to black candidates in general this year, have they?
Let's just quickly run through it. Ayanna Pressley in Boston, she was expected to lose her challenge to a Democratic sitting congressman. By 13, she won by 18 points, 31-point spread. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was expected to lose in also challenging a Democratic incumbent congressman by 36. She won by 15, 51-point spread. And then you look at the three candidates for governor, Stacey Abrams, the three black Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams in Georgia. She was expected to win by about 20 at the end. She won by over 50. Andrew Gillum in Florida was expected to come in fourth. He took the nomination, Florida being the third largest state, and we talked about Jealous. So what I'm seeing here is a disturbing pattern of pollsters time and again undercounting the support for progressive candidates of color. And Richard, this becomes an even bigger problem when the press then blasts these out in headlines, because the message that sends to voters is your candidate has no shot.
Right.
So when you're busy on election day and you got 17 things to do, stay home. Your candidate's got no shot. And not only that, it says the same thing to donors. No one wants to back a Shirleyzer. And so you see the money drying up, particularly with Ben Jealous in Maryland. And it has the very real risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's one of the reasons I was very pleased to see what the Associated Press said earlier this year in saying that because polls are so often intoxicating for journalists, the AP's words, they were updating the AP style book, offering this word of caution, quote, poll results that seek to preview the outcome of an election must never be the lead, headline, or single subject of any story.
But of course, they are time and again.
Time and again.
And look, this is great work. And now, as you say, now Ben Jealous is on the losing end of these polls again with potentially very harmful results to his candidacy, which I take to mean he can still win. But at any rate, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. So Pete Tucker, journalist extraordinaire, people can find your stuff in Counterpunch and elsewhere. Thanks for doing all this great reporting, and thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Richard. Thanks for having me.